Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this, our very final unit of AP Biology, which is ecology. And ecology is the study of the interactions of organisms with each other and with their environment. So if you are somebody who is interested in learning more about the environment, this is the unit for you. If you're somebody who, I don't know, lives in the environment, which we all do, you really should know a lot about this because we certainly have an impact on this environment we inhabit. So in this first screencast of the unit, we are going to first of all start with just the different levels of study in ecology, and then we're going to roll into the very first level of study, which is behavior. So the first level at which we can study ecology is at the level of the individual organism. And so our first chapter is on behavior. And the big question here is, what types of behaviors do species exhibit, and why do they exhibit them? Here you see all sorts of different behaviors. Wolves howling, a little cardinal singing his heart out, an ant carrying a leaf, a bee making honey, we're grooming each other, we're following mom and dad. Why would natural selection favor these behaviors? What benefit does it bring to the individual to engage in these behaviors? That's really the question of this first level of study. After that, we are going to look at the level of the population. Populations represent all the individuals of the same species in a particular location. And whoever's studying the population gets to define what that particular location is. But the key is it's the same species. So we could study all the monarch butterflies in a particular forest in Mexico. But if we introduce some other butterfly, a different species, that would not be part of the population. So populations are just one species. The next level of ecology is the community. The community represents all the individuals of different species in a particular location. So here we have a coral reef with all sorts of different species, from the coral to the microscopic plankton floating around in there to the fish that you see and the different species of fish. And they're all interacting in different ways. We can study that at the level of the community. Same here, we have these different herbivores in Africa hanging out. That's another community. Then we can study the ecosystem. The ecosystem includes all the living and non-living factors in a particular location. So this is roughly broken down into tracking the flow of energy through an ecosystem and then the cycling of materials. And so, we're going to look at the rocks and the soil and the sunlight exposure and the temperature and the air pressure and things like that, and how those affect different species. Finally, our grand finale for the year is we are going to look at the biosphere. That is the portion of Earth inhabited by life, all the ecosystems on Earth. And the sad focus of this is going to be, how are humans impacting that biosphere? And spoiler alert, we're having a pretty negative effect right now. So we're going to get to the bottom what the science is telling us about how we're affecting the environment, talking about climate change and other environmental issues, and then hopefully raise some awareness of some things there. So this very first chapter, it's called Animal Behavior with a Smattering of Plants. And so the kind of general theme here is behavioral ecology. And behavioral ecology is really the study of the evolutionary basis for why animals behave the way that they do. So remember, behaviors, just like any other characteristic, they're going to be shaped by genes, they're going to be shaped by experience, they're going to be shaped by the environment. And so natural selection is going to act on these behaviors, and therefore they must increase fitness. And so we're going to be looking at a wide variety of behaviors and trying to get at this question, well, why would this kind of behavior have evolved? So to open this chapter, I really encourage you to pause and watch this video. And in fact, this PowerPoint could be really boring or really amazing, depending on your willingness to pause and watch these various videos. There's a lot of really cool videos in here. So please, please, please pause, watch this video, Death to the Hornet, and then tune back in. Did you watch? Are you back? Okay, good. So hopefully you saw a hornet coming in and a whole bunch of little tiny bees coming in, buzzing around, and raising the temperature, essentially cooking that thing alive. And so you might look at that situation and think, how would this kind of behavior evolve? So to think about this, let's suppose I'm one of the bees in that hive, and I'm seeing all my buddies go on and fight that hornet off. Wouldn't it be safer for me to just kick back and let them do the work? And if that's true, then wouldn't my genes be passed on more than my neighbor's genes because I'm sitting out staying safe while they're going in and risking their lives? And so then isn't the logical conclusion that the cowardice genes would eventually spread and then this kind of behavior would disappear? So why hasn't it? How would something like this have evolved? And I'm not going to tell you yet. We're going to kind of circle back to this at the end and try and figure that out. So hopefully if you haven't watched that video, you're going to pause now and watch it because it's cool. Okay. So the first type of behavior we're going to look at are innate behaviors. Innate behaviors are instinctive behaviors that don't need to be learned. And to start off, I'm going to actually use an example from plants. And you might think, wait, plants have behavior? And yeah, plants do in fact respond to their environment in different ways. And so we would call that a type of behavior. And an example of this is phototropism. Phototropism is the growth of a plant towards the light. You may have seen this at your house. If you just have a potted plant sitting by a window, that potted plant will eventually start to bend towards the light. And I like to mess with my house plants. I'll rotate them so now it's facing the inside of the room. And then sure enough, within a few hours, it bends back towards the light and you kind of flip it back and forth and play around with it. Here's another example of that too. And then a more dramatic example where it's kind of weaving. So the question is, why would natural selection favor this response? And then while we're doing it, that AP test is coming up. What specifically is light used to do during photosynthesis? So think about those questions. Here's the answer. So why would natural selection favor this response? Well, obviously light is essential for photosynthesis, and photosynthesis is how plants get energy. And so a plant that can bend toward that light and get as much light as possible is going to do better than a plant that doesn't. So natural selection would favor that behavior. The second question, what specifically is light used to do? Well, you may recall that light is what excites the electron in that photosystem to jump up to a higher energy level. And there's photosystem 2, photosystem 1, and the first, over here where the light electron gets excited, it's kind of passed down an electron transport chain, generates a proton gradient, which is used to make, ATP. Over here, the electron is passed to NADP plus to make NADPH, and then that ATP and NADPH goes to the Calvin cycle where it's used to create sugars. So light is obviously very beneficial. Bending towards the light is useful. I'll also toss in one other quick review, Juxtacrine signaling. You may recall that, that from Unit 4, this is where cells communicate through direct contact. And I briefly mentioned way back in the day, plasmodesmata as these little gaps between, in the cell wall between plant cells that allow materials to pass through. And it turns out there's a hormone called auxin that can travel down the length of the plant through these little plasmodesmata, and then light causes the opposite side to send that hormone down, and then that hormone elongates those cells. And if one side of the plant over here is elongated, but this side is not elongated, that will kind of create a bending effect, bending it towards the light. So you don't need to know the mechanism of that, but it's kind of an interesting application of that Juxtacrine signaling. Finally, there's a link to a Radiolab podcast called Smarty Plants, and this one will kind of blow your mind with the way plants are able to detect their surroundings and respond. Maybe a little bit later on your own time, you could check that one out. That's kind of a bonus one. Innate behaviors in animals. Again, just like in that plant, we want these behaviors to increase survival and fitness. So an example of a very simple one of these, well, it's not a simple behavior, but one you're all familiar with at least, is web spinning. When a spider spins a web, it performs a very similar sequence of movements that are never learned. They are just born innately able to make a web, and they just do it. So that's kind of what we mean by innate behaviors. Definitely click that link about this spider that makes this incredible web, and there's some high drama in that video too that's worth watching. Another example of an innate behavior is something called a fixed action pattern. And a fixed action pattern is a sequence of unlearned actions that are directly linked to a stimulus. So they're unlearned and they're linked to a stimulus. So they're like fixed, meaning it's just, you just do it without thinking. It's a fixed behavior. And then it's an action pattern because it's a sequence of actions. The cue, that stimulus here, is called a sign stimulus, and that's a cue that triggers this fixed action pattern. So let me give you an example of this. In male stickleback fish, if a male sees another male in his nesting territory, he will attack it. In other words, males sort of carve out these little nesting territories, and the females will lay their eggs, and then the males can deposit sperm on that. Well, if some other male is coming into some original guy's territory, he's like, hey, get out of here. And so we know that the male stickleback fish will attack his rivals. Well, the question is, what triggers this behavior? And it turns out that the sign stimulus for this is the red belly that they have. And so there's an experiment done. You can see kind of a low budget video of this on that link. That's kind of an optional one if you want to see it. But they created realistic models of the male stickleback fish that looked just like them, but lacked the red belly. And it turns out that the males will not attack that. Doesn't matter. That's fine. This guy can hang out all they want. But if you create some unrealistic looking model with that red belly, that male is going to attack that thing. And so the red belly is the sign stimulus that triggers the fixed action pattern. That is, the red belly causes this male to attack its rival. So again, this is not learned in any way. It's just innate. It's born within them. If they see a red belly, they will attack it. They're not thinking it through. And then you might think, well, how does this increase fitness? Well, if you can keep rival males out of your territory, that increases how many offspring you're able to have, because more females will lay eggs that you can then deposit your sperm onto in that area. Here's another example, a goose. So what you're going to see, here's the goose. It's kind of grainy black and white. This is a very early study in animal behavior. And if an egg starts to roll away from the nest, the goose will grab it with its beak and kind of roll the egg back. But in this video, you're going to see a researcher pull the egg away from the goose as it's rolling it back, and watch what happens. You'll notice that that goose continued to complete that action even after the egg was removed. So he removes it, and the goose continues to keep going with that action. So again, the sign stimulus is the egg pulled away. The fixed action pattern is rolling the beak all the way back. If this goose was thinking critically about this situation and problem solving like a human would, then when the egg was removed, the goose would say, ah, my goal was to pull the egg back, and that goal has been thwarted. I must change my approach. But it's not thinking it through like a human would. It is engaging in an innate, pre-programmed behavior. It's a fixed action pattern. Egg removed, do the little neck roll thing to bring it back. And even if the egg is pulled away, it still does the neck roll thing because it's just an instinctive behavior. I think we'll pause it here. We'll pick up with this in part 2.